has my usual boilerplate slides in there.
Okay, okay.
About the dates and which lists to use and all that.
Okay,
So
good.
I'll fire through all
Okay,
that.
right, okay, yeah. Alrighty.
And we can start whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I'm good to go. I got it.
Okay.
I'm ready to fly.
Good morning. This is the dispatch working group and the art area general meeting. One will follow the other. The blue sheets are circulating. Please make sure you get your name on them if not. Sure.
Oh, okay.
So we have there's a 2.5 hour general meeting slot. Dispatch and art area take up the first 90 minutes. HTTP BIS will start in here immediately at 11 o'clock. And Mark Nottingham is waving his finger at me that better be the case.
It will be.
Yes.
Quick technical interrupt. This room is very echoey.
Okay.
So I'm finding it hard to understand. I'm having to concentrate more than usual. Everyone, please speak as slowly as possible.
Okay.
I'll try not to talk now.
If folks are having trouble hearing, maybe you could move towards the front of the room also.
Our note taker said, say again, John?
Right, okay, right. So
Oh, I see.
So John Levine, our note takers are sitting up front, so when you go to the microphone, please say your name so they can make sure and capture that.
The microphones are sufficiently far away from them that they will not be able to read your badge, so please say your name at the mic. Thank you to our scribes and note takers. Those have already been selected. Please note the note well. The RFC and BCP numbers on here may actually be a bit stale. This is a recycled slide. I will update them after this meeting, but the slide identifies your rights and obligations with respect to intellectual property and contributions within the IETF. My condensed slide, you have the right to remain silent, et cetera, et cetera. Anything you say is a contribution to the IETF. Please read those prior BCPs and RFCs if you have any questions about this. So beginning the dispatch part of this meeting, the deadlines for IETF 101, we have standard rotating deadlines about how to get yourself on the agenda, how to get things appropriate attention if they're being dispatched. These are the deadlines that I backtracked from based on what the date of the next IETF meeting. They may be slightly off by a day or two. I may have counted incorrectly in my jet lag nature last night, but please aim for these if you have work that you want to have dispatch discuss at IETF 101. The general purpose of these deadlines is if you make the deadlines, you will get agenda time pretty much guaranteed, unless there's huge competition for it, which is uncommon. If you miss the deadlines, you're behind any other business in terms of priority. Please start your draft names as normal with draft, your last name, and dispatch. So that way they are associated with this working group, even prior to them being accepted as working group items or being dispatched. There are 2 mailing lists that are relevant to the work in this working group. One is the art, which is for general discussion of art and what used to be RIE topics, but things that are specifically to be discussed as work items of this working group should be on the dispatch list. Moving right along, I'm going to move to the floor mic for a brief discussion of a draft I put out. There's no slide.
Right, I know. Yeah, there are no slides for this, so listen closely to Marie.
So this is the name of a draft that was posted recently to the dispatch list. It introduces a compression technology that we are seeking to have published as an informational document and registers a media type and a content encoding for it. It is the processing path we're looking for here is very similar to the way Broadly did it, which is to describe the format, register the code points, and pretty much that's all. This got the attention of HTTP BIS briefly because they were concerned that we are seeking to have browser adoption for this right away. That is not the case. That's not a targeted use case, so I don't think there's much overlap here. So there has been a lot of discussion on the list and both off the list, and so I wanted to be fully on the record and say that it sounds like the agreed path here, putting the ADs on the spot a bit, but the agreed path here is that this would be AD-sponsored and informational document and does not need its own working group. We're not really sure who would look at it other than, because there isn't really a compression working group, or that sort of talent is not readily available inside the IETF, so that seems like the path that I've heard agreed to. Martin at the mic.
Yeah, Martin Thompson. The only thing that I would say is that the content type, the media type, I'm not sure that you have a strong case for that. Brightly didn't do it. If you could make a case for that, that would be handy, just to sort of clear the air a bit.
Okay.
Harald Alderström. Just since I read this draft this morning, two questions. What is this useful for, and what's the IPR situation?
What was the second one?
IPR.
IPR. What is this useful for? It's probably the same thing that gzip and Brotli would be used for, except for we don't have, Brotli is very much geared toward browser space. We have different applications in mind, like the Linux kernel is using it. So there are other application spaces where it's potentially useful.
So compression of text?
Yes, compression of text, compression of arbitrary data.
Okay, compression of good compression of text with reasonable compression of arbitrary data?
I believe so. I should point out that I am not one of the developers of the technology. I'm working the IETF process on their behalf. So my answers about the technology are secondhand.
Because if it's no better than gzip, then why add another? That was...
It produces better performance than gzip, that I'm certain.
Good.
And the IPR question, we are in compliance with 78 and 79. There's nothing to declare. You look like you're ready to go to the mic.
Yeah, Alexei Melnikov. I think once upon a time we were registering content transfer encodings, at least for email and other places,
right,
where they still used. I think what I remember from Ned talking about it is that it's very hard to actually add content transfer encodings as opposed to media types to various end systems. That's why we basically sort of stopped doing this, and except for very specialized cases. That's coming back to why media type might be a
I see.
Possible, need, basically.
Yes, okay. Should I say that in the draft, that that's the current method of doing it, or is it worth doing that, or just in the write-up?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it needs saying, but it's just, if the questions comes up again, that maybe worth doing it.
Okay. I learned in processing this document that there's a difference between content transfer encoding and content encoding. So I learned something about, those are not quite the same thing. I'm sorry?
You'll need to go to the microphone, Bright.
If you want to troll me, you have to do it at the mic.
Yeah.
So.
Well, we have remote participants as well. So that's, yeah.
Yeah, so Martin Thompson, don't worry about transfer codings. They're not going to deploy, at least in HTTP, as far as I know.
I'm happy to not come.
So my question that I got up for was, what do you expect? What more do you want from this room? Are we done?
Mostly just to say that that's the processing path that I'm hearing we should follow. And if there's any other suggestion, I'd love to hear it. Otherwise, I'm going to be... So last night, Ben and Adam both said not it. So guess who I'm going to go talk to next?
There's no coin flip. Come on, Alexei.
A three-sided coin, okay.
For the record, I really didn't like sponsoring Broadly document. That was not... I was not very happy.
Okay.
But I might be more happy with this one. We'll see.
Okay, I'll come talk to you.
I can take it.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Nothing else, I'm done.
All righty, so we're going to get to the art area stuff. Updates from the area directors. You guys want to get up and say anything?
Just a very quick note, there isn't much general update from us as far as I know, but we have this new art directorate for reviewing documents, which doesn't have very many members, but it was actually, we're sort of trying it out, and it was quite useful in the last 6 months or so. We had some reviewers who done more than others, and in particular Martin Thompson and reviewed 3 documents, and Mark Nottingham reviewed 2 documents, and this was very helpful to art AGs. So art AGs would like to thank all the reviewers. No, there are more people than two of you, but you review the most documents, you know.
Can you send a link to that review team to the group so people can see who's on it?
Yes.
Okay.
And are you looking for volunteers?
You look very confused, Mark. You review 2 documents. I checked it in the morning. Okay.
And also, you may want to call the old, I guess, Rye Art and see who all was on there, right?
Oh yeah. So, and the
Okay.
other part of it is, you know, I think we'll slowly trying to recruit more people. In particular, people,
Yeah.
you know, you're an expert, so I'm
Yeah.
trying to find some specific names. But
Yeah.
you know,
Well,
if people want to volunteer, come talk
Yeah.
to us.
Well, you could just do what I did, and I took people and just added them to the list and told them they were there, but.
Well, I did try to do this and didn't work this time.
Okay,
So.
okay.
Okay, Adam.
So the other thing that I wanted to point out is, in case anyone missed it, we have a new working group in the area now, DNS over HTTPS, and they're having their inaugural meeting this Thursday. So anyone, sorry?
You're 2 slides ahead of us.
Oh, sorry. Well, that was my thing. You can go ahead and do it then.
Okay, thanks. Ben didn't have anything to say?
Okay.
Okay, we're good.
We normally enumerate the BOFs that are scheduled for the week. I've neglected to actually invite the chairs to talk about it. So these are the 4. If anybody wants to say something in the mic about what they are, why we're interested, and when they are, please head up. But since we didn't actually invite anyone, I don't actually expect that. And the 2 working groups that are chartered since then, DOE and Extra, the Extra chair is here. Yes, do you want to say anything about your working group, or just have everybody go read the charter? And DOE that Adam just mentioned. Someone's up?
No.
He's not up, okay.
They're handing blue sheet. Okay.
I am with S-MIME, Ben.
Ben, you're up, dude.
Slides going here. Hold on a second. No, it isn't. Bam. There we go. Full size.
I am up here strictly as a individual contributor, so my area director hat is off and I guess in Adam's possession until I sit back down. And so Russ Housley and I put this draft together. Unfortunately, Russ couldn't be here for medical reasons, so everyone hopefully send good wishes to him. There may be some questions I will have to defer to him. I don't know if he's remotely attending or not.
No, he's not.
Okay. So if you step forward, anyway, this is about using S-MIME for SIP and MSRP messaging. And some motivation here, one of the primary use cases, it's not the only use case, but the kind of motivating use cases, we've got organizations that are starting more and more to use mobile messaging to send various kinds of notifications. And some of these are notifications that can be fairly security sensitive. So for example, financial transactions notices or password change notices or any number of other kinds of things that if they were falsified can cause problems. And as you can see, there's a number of ways these can fail. I think that's pretty obvious. Next slide. Believe it or not, there are still people that care about messaging applications in the simple environment. I know it's easy for us to say that no one really cares about interoperable messaging anymore, but there are some ecosystems that are using this. For example, Vultr, when you're doing SMS over Vultr, you use a SIP message. And then there's this RCS thing that a lot of operators, mobile operators still care about, which uses both SIP messaging and MSRP. And for the use case that I just mentioned, signed messaging is kind of your low-hanging fruit, and that's because it doesn't really invoke the client certificate problem. So the idea of an organization sending notifications to a lot of its users is a fairly easy thing to address compared to, say, encrypted messaging. So some highlights of what are in the draft. So we suggest some updates to some of the algorithm requirements that are already in SIP and MSRP. So we suggest that they must support ECDSA plus SHA-256. And actually, I'm not going to go through and read every one of these, but also wanting to add, for encrypting, we want to add the AES 128 CBC and elliptical curves there as well. We also have some suggestions about putting SIP URIs in the subject alternative names in certificates. So because that's the identity that's typically going to be, you're going to need a match to when you're dealing with both SIP and MSRP. And actually, very importantly, whatever you do, don't put MSRP URLs in there. They're useless for that purpose. Next slide. We've got some general stuff about how user agents can express what kind of S-MIME capabilities they have. This is primarily through the use of identifying what MIME types they can handle. And this is not entirely satisfactory in some areas. For example, SIP forking makes it difficult to know for sure that the user agent that you're hitting is the user agent that you might think you know its capabilities. Some other things, SIP message has very tight size limits when we start talking about any kind of complex messaging. So we need to keep those messages small. And for both SIP and MSRP, the SIP and their respective specs assume that decryption is happening immediately when you deliver things. So they make some requirements around 415 and 493 responses that may not make sense in a world where encryption may not happen until you've got user eyeballs on the message, which may be minutes or hours after the message was sent to the user agent. For MSRP, we need to just clarify, it's probably obvious, but we clarify it anyway, that you apply your S-MIME things before you chunk, if you're breaking things into chunks. And I already mentioned don't use the MSRP URIs for certificate matching. Next slide. So there are some issues to think about in these general ecosystems, and some of these are really questions about what people care about and what is actually out there deployed. So if people remember CPIM, which deep in our history of RISE treatment of messaging, allows us to add metadata into messaging in addition to what metadata might be in the SIP or MSRP headers. And so an open question is, do we care about that? There may be some use cases for it. For example, you have session border controls that still mess with SIP from and to headers, which could cause us some problems on certificate matching. There might be some other applications of throwing in various other pieces of metadata that we want to be attached to the signatures. There may be some interactions with IMDN, that would be the instant messaging delivery notifications. Somehow or another, we let the the IMDN specs get by to explicitly allow application servers to modify CPIM headers in existing messages. That's a problem for signatures. Now, I don't know how much of that's happening in the real world. I suspect not much. The draft needs examples. And as almost always the case with a 0.0, I'm sure the security considerations need some expansions. Next, please.
Okay, he's got the questions there.
So really at this point, we'd like to draw people's attention to it, get feedback on it. We've had a few comments on the list. And my question is, do people think this subject space is worth working on? And if they do so, how should we move forward with it? And my comments on this, like I said, this seems like overkill for a working group.
Well, I mean, we've done many working groups with pretty small documents.
That's true. This
And the
is
one
a
reason
really
why-
small document.
I know, but one reason why I think it might be helpful is that you might get some of the security people helping you work on it a little bit more, right? I don't think.
Yes, I can see that.
Yeah, okay.
I will blur my not having my AD hat on a little bit by just pointing out that things like SIP Brandy, which are probably a little bit more complex than this, have not moved as fast as we would have liked as the mini working group. So,
Well, but I don't think it's the mini working group aspect that's the problem.
okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sean was first.
Hi, Sean Leonard. So overall, I read the draft and I want to speak generally in favor of it. I think that it should move forward. The process that it goes through, I don't have a strong opinion on. And the only thing I'd say is within the context of all the other IETF related work around secure messaging or whatever, that it just specify the version of SMIME, which would probably be version 4, since that's what's currently being worked on, to minimize interoperability testing headaches. But generally, I'm in favor of the draft.
Good point. Thank you.
Martin.
Yeah, Martin Thompson. I have a couple of questions about things like scope that makes me think that a working group might actually be a better choice here. Is this first to point-to-point messaging? You're not talking about multi-party cases?
I don't think we're explicitly excluding multi-party cases. The use case I mentioned of organizations sending to users, I can easily see multi-party being sent there. Now, when you say multi-party, do you mean through list exploiter type multi-party or conference bridges? Or do you mean...
So this is kind of the question that I've badly formed, but managing group keying mechanisms or sending messages to large groups of people and ensuring that the message can't be read by the exploiter, for instance, is challenging, and we don't have a whole lot of good key management solutions in this space.
So I agree. That's very interesting stuff. I don't necessarily see that kind of thing in scope here. Boy, it'd be nice if it could be, and we could just solve it easy.
So you're not attempting to address that problem. You're just looking to
not
apply the existing
yet.
tools to the...
Not yet. And you'll notice that it's been mentioned to me offline. This draft completely waives its hands on certificate management, other than just assuming general PKI type stuff.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going. If you're actually attempting to do anything meaningful here, you kind of need to tackle that problem. And so that sort of leads me to the conclusion that overkill is probably a not even close to right. It's the opposite. If you don't do a working group, you're not going to give this the attention that it actually deserves.
Okay.
Hi, John Peterson. So probably unsurprisingly, my question about this is why you want to do this with SMIME instead of STIR in general. And there are at least 3, I think, good reasons to say that. One is one of the reasons we ended up doing STIR in the first place because nobody did SMIME, right? It's not like we didn't try to put SMIME in 232.61. We didn't try to patch it like 15 times. We didn't do that. AIB, what was that again? The authenticated identity body thing, right? To try to minimize the things we'd be signing with SMIME, very similar to a CPM approach. So I mean, we ran that code a number of times. When I looked at what your use cases were for this, which are things like the GSMA, which are things like VoLTE, those are endpoints of telephone numbers. They're going to want all the certificate infrastructure that STIR has created for that. And if you want to do cryptography with that as well, in addition to this identity, I'm afraid SIP Brandy is probably your best bet. I mean, no joke. I mean, from a security perspective, who is actually going to implement like SMIME for SIP for these applications? Whereas I see a lot of people that seem to be doing STIR who are like real carriers and stuff. So like, what's the motivation to do it this way?
Okay, so first of all, thank you for asking that question. You checked one of my check boxes in my discussions with Russ about what our questions were going to be.
Good. Yeah.
And right now, the counter argument for that is that in these particular ecosystems, the code already exists in a lot of the user agents to handle SMIME, or at least on the platforms they're on to handle SMIME for other reasons. They're doing it in their mail packages. So that sort of thing, while going with a JWT, JWS sort of approach, I think it's very interesting. And I don't think any work here should prevent doing that work. But I think that is going to require more greenfield coding on the clients than an SMIME approach might. Right now, from what I see happening in STIR, I think that eventually you're going to have STIR validations done on clients, but maybe not right away. So
sure. Yes, there is more carrier code for that, and there's going to be like endpoint code for that. But like the cert management stuff doesn't just make you think you need to clone everything that STIR is doing?
I think there can certainly be some relationships there.
Hi, Christer Holmberg. I'm proxying for my colleagues working with RCS, and I get one question and one comment. The question is whether this excludes direct peer-to-peer messaging between 2 endpoints. If there's a reason why it wouldn't work for that, I don't know if that's related to what Martin was asking. And the comment is on, maybe it's too detailed to discuss here, but I give it anyway. It's on the CPIM. The draft says that most of the time, or typically, the whole CPIM body is encrypted, but the headers can't be encrypted in a lot of use cases because there are use cases for this, like store and forward later and things like that, where you need this information, so you can't really encrypt it. I don't really know if maybe that's just a detail, but just to make sure there's not that you don't assume the whole thing to be encrypted for this to work. That's all.
Okay, actually, thank you for that comment. That's kind of why I had CPM listed as do we need more discussion here? And I think you're suggesting we do. And how that's going to fall out is not immediately obvious. I'm trying to back up to your first comment, and I actually fell out of my head. Can you repeat the first part of your comment again?
Now, the first one was a question whether this could be used peer-to-peer between
right.
two endpoints, or whether there's a reason or security related or whatever that it wouldn't work for that.
I don't think there is any technical reason why it couldn't be used. I think there are practical deployment reasons why it's hard, and that goes back to what Martin was saying about key management or certificate management. That's kind of why we were pointing to the organization sending to its users as more of a one-to-many relationship, where it's much easier to deal with signing certificates than in a encrypted, well, we don't want to discount encrypted, but a encrypted model or a encrypted messaging or end-user signed messaging is harder because of the the certificate distribution issues. And this draft does not attack that problem at all, but I recognize it is a problem worth thinking about. Regular public key infrastructures can deal more with the organization to users, while if we're going to talk about anything involving end user certificates, then we need to think more about how we're going to handle that.
Andrew Allen, I had sort of a similar sort of reaction, I guess, to John on this with YSMIME. I mean, to my knowledge, there doesn't seem to be a lot of implementations out there. At least there wasn't 2 years ago when this issue came up in FreeGBP. I looked at least at CIPIT. I looked at all the CIPIT results. There was hardly any SMIME implementations that were showing up at CIPIT, at least a few years ago. And so if the use case here is commercial carriers, I'm not sure if this is something they're going to use.
Yeah.
And maybe it may be worth looking at different security mechanisms. Maybe there should be a general framework or considerations, and then like for particular security mechanisms.
I don't want to get
because at least in 3GPP right now, well, no one's using SMIME.
I think I don't want to get too far into implementations and solving the problem when we haven't figured out even how we're going to process the work yet. So,
well, but this is a question about whether the work is worth doing.
Okay, fair enough.
So without diving into that, and probably need a time check, but without diving into the technical details, I don't think doing one precludes doing the other. There's a question about what resources we want to put on there, but I think there is, and I think it's worth more discussion. I think there is a constituency for doing this in SMIME, which is a sufficient reason to do it. That doesn't mean that SMIME is the best solution for the world, and I certainly would love to see work done taking a STIR approach to this sort of thing as well. I just didn't propose that work.
Martin Dolly, AT&T. There is the U.S. wireless community that is requesting this, Andrew.
He's not going to the mic. Okay, so do we have someone who wants to work with Ben on chartering this, proposing a charter or a problem statement or some scoping work or anything like that could help us decide here?
Look at all those hands.
Yeah,
Well, the
right.
question would be who thinks this is a problem?
Everyone jump on the
we're solving,
bandwagon. Everyone
right?
behind you has their hands up.
Right. Whether or not you like this solution, who thinks this is a problem we're solving?
There's hands.
Okay. Okay. Then the question is, who would like to work with Ben to come up with a charter and scope, et cetera? Oh, we have an IAB member standing up there. Okay, Mr. Thompson.
Don't give that any more weight than it deserves. Martin Thompson, when you ask a question, who thinks this is a problem worth solving? You're saying, do you want a unicorn? And so it's not really I don't get a lot of signal from that. But
Well, the question was secure messaging, right? Do we need a solution? Right.
I think the more pertinent question here is there enough momentum behind the effort and enough of a chance of this being successful that we think this is worth doing right now? And I'm not sure about that point. It seems like we have people interested in having the work done. I'm interested in seeing the work done if it were possible, but do we actually have enough thrust to get it over the line? And I'm not sure what the answer is on that one. I'd like to see a little more work on it, perhaps.
Right.
But
And can I make a quick scope comment too? I think the idea of attacking secure messaging would be a wonderful thing for us to do. I don't know if it's a practical thing for us to do. That wasn't really the intent of this draft by itself. This draft was to clarify some usage issues around the use of S-MIME, because we believe, as Martin pointed out, that there is at least some community that would like to use S-MIME in a mobile messaging type environment.
So maybe we get members of that community to work with you then.
Right. If it turns out that there's people that want to do mobile messaging, secure messaging, and this needs to be part of that work, that's great too, but I don't want to solve the boil the ocean to solve a clarification issue.
Okay. Adam or Stephen?
Sorry, I got to say two things. The first is, if we do decide to move forward with this, I'm happy to work with Ben on the charter. But I think we're kind of hopping over the question of who would be willing to work on this. That's what I would like to see a show of hands for before we even talk about it. About whether we're moving this into a working group or dispositioning it any other way.
Okay, who in the room would work on this if Stephen's interrupting?
So, but not interrupting, just begging. Stephen, just a question. So when you're saying this in that the previous question, are we talking this equals an S-MIME based solution, or this equals the functionality?
Well, we don't quite know yet because we don't have a clear problem statement. So that may be this. The overall question may be a little premature then, I guess, right?
I'm sort of leaning towards who wants to work on writing one down.
Yeah.
Okay, and then just a comment is that for the this equals S-MIME question, it would help me if there was information available about what implementations actually exist, because I'm not clear about that. I know it's been hard to get them, but I don't know. Maybe they do exist and we just don't know about them.
I know that some do exist on the mail side, and whether or not code that's in mail applications on mobile platforms can be turned around and used in the messaging applications, I have no clue. But for example, the mail app in a iOS can handle S-MIME typically in enterprise situations where you're using the enterprise management functions to control your certificates.
So John Peterson again. So yeah, I think secure messaging thing is worth us doing and being right about. I would kind of look at that though as a very separate thing. And let's make these tweaks to S-MIME so that the 450 and so on works right. If you're gonna do that, I'm not terribly interested, to be honest. I know I wrote a lot of that S-MIME stuff back in the day. So maybe partially my fault that it's messed up, but at the same time, I don't think I would invest a lot of energy into that. If there was a secure messaging thing though, I'd want a problem statement and for us to talk about what the right way is to do secure messaging. Because I'm not convinced that this is the right overall approach to that. So again, depending which one of those two things it is, if it was secure messaging, definitely I'd be happy to help out with that.
Okay, so to avoid accidentally boffing secure messaging, I think the question, and I'll let the chair is, again, my ED hat is not on, but as an individual contributor, my question is around who would help progress work on clarifying the use of S-MIME in SIP and MSRP, potentially doing more work around that, like some key management stuff, although that's not in the draft, and I don't know if that's something we need to do, is a question I think is very interesting to me. The question about general secure messaging, putting my AD hat back on, is also very interesting to me, and I would be amazed if we have a constituent for that. I think we need to talk, but that's not the problem the draft is trying to solve.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Jim Fenton. Some of the use, I apologize for coming in the middle of this and missing some of it, but some of the use cases that were mentioned, things like password resets and financial notifications, are things that I don't think, we tend to use email for them a lot, and it's a very bad solution to that. But I think that there's enough there that we should be looking more broadly at how we do it. Assuming that we want to do it necessarily with SIP or MSRP or S-MIME, I think we need to kind of step back from it a little bit and look at the overall requirements for what would be a good medium in order to convey that kind of notification, and figure out what the best way to do it is. I'm not convinced that any of the technologies that we're talking about here are necessarily the right answer.
Okay, so referring to that a little bit, I don't disagree with what you're saying in general, but the world we're in right now it's worse than just email. Companies using SMS for this.
I'm acutely aware of that.
Which it seems to me is be the worst of all possible worlds to be used for that. But they use that because that's what gets to their users reliably. And when they start looking at other approaches to this, they can't assume that all their users can get it for what might exist right now. A lot of organizations are using smartphone apps for similar purposes, which depending on the smartphone app might be great, it might be awful, who knows. The community, particularly some of the US mobile community that Martin mentioned, is acutely worried about this. And that's why they're looking specifically at ways to move into a more secure mobile messaging type environment. Getting everyone to agree on better technologies to use for this kind of use cases, I think would be a wonderful thing, but I don't have a lot of hope in success.
Well, just as a for instance of the sort of thing that what we currently have doesn't work is the notifier doesn't have any way of knowing that the message actually got there. It tends to be sort of fire and forget. Mm-hmm. And for things like a notification that there's been a big financial transaction or something like that, the bank might want to know that message was actually delivered. Some of the things that have come along since, like iMessage, give you some of that. But it's a separate infrastructure and proprietary and all of that. And I think we need more of that in a publicly available mechanism.
Thanks.
Okay.
So
John,
one last thing I know. Just about again, from the scoping perspective, if the cert management component of this becomes, then again, I think that gets much more interesting, right? And like there are things that I think evolve from what's going on with Acme, what's going on with Stir, and so on, that if you weren't doing it that way, again, I think I would probably want to have bunk heads. So
we'll close the mics after Sean. We need to move on.
Kirster, this is more a general comment. I think if there are people who want to use this, and if we think there's something regarding to the usage that needs to be clarified or maybe updated and so on, I think we should do it. I mean, this is the reasons why I and others, for example, in SIP core, we have had a lot of problems with session timer and so on, because it's actually something that people are deploying, and sooner or later you're going to start getting this, emails when things don't work, and if the specification is unclear, it's very difficult to say whose fault it is and so on. So I think if this is something that SMIME is part of 3261, so it's a valid thing to use. So if something needs to be clarified and people want to use it, I think we should do it. Thank you.
All right, Sean Leonard. I think that the current draft in its general scope, omitting certificate management and stuff like that, is the right approach. There's a lot of stuff that can be done there, but I think that it's out of scope. And in point of fact, SMIME as a general framework can do a lot of authentication or protection of content that has nothing to do with certificates at all. For example, you can use pre-shared keys or passwords or things like that. So there's a lot more applications where this is very relevant to using in a SIP environment without needing to necessarily bring in the baggage or kind of deal with the dragons of certificates specifically.
Okay, so it sounds like let's focus back on Ben's draft, and let's go back to the question of who would be willing to work on Ben, with Ben on SMIME on this. Okay, so we've got 4 people. Okay. And again, we would still like, a crisper problem statement and scope, right?
Right.
Yeah, it does seem from the discussion that there is some interest in the general secure messaging, but until we have something on the table, we're not really going to do anything with that right now.
Right.
That might be something that the interested parties want to get together and talk about. And again, we don't want to do another SIP brandy where we actually did the real solution people were doing and then the more general problem, because that didn't work well.
And just one closing remark, since you mentioned problem statement, I agree that there's not a clear problem statement in the draft. I can, a quick remark on that. I think, the core of the problem statement is that we believe there's some people that want to do SMIME. And right now, the way things are specified in the existing specs, it's hard to do SMIME in an interoperative way for a messaging application, as opposed to, say, moving STP around for signal and calls type application.
Okay, yep. Yep, and again, you've got people that are willing to work with you on that problem, so. All righty. So, John Clenson, we need you to put yourself in the queue to speak so I can push the red button and put you on the screen. Because John's presenting remotely here on this topic. Okay.
He's at it.
Okay.
Go ahead.
There we go. Okay, John, you're up. It looks like you've got the platform here.
Yeah, I've got the audio. I'm not sending video. Now we may be sending video.
Well, there you go. We got you.
Okay. We're in an interesting situation with internationalization in that most of us think it's important if we're going to have and support an internet with people who speak different languages and use different scripts. But it raised a number of issues, and we need to figure out how to get ourselves unstuck, because we've basically been stuck for the last couple of years. And this presentation is not about the usual put everybody to sleep internationalization tutorial. It's focused with a very brief introduction on this unstucking question and on trying to figure out how we move forward in a complex situation where the depth of knowledge scattered throughout the IETF is not, well, it's either not deep or not broad or both. Next slide.
Come on. Why is it working? There it goes.
When we talk about these issues, much of the time our focus has been on character encoding and matching. That's not all of the problem. A very broad set of issues. They include data and time formats and time zones, which affects calendaring, data entry conventions, which affects user interfaces and character pickers and input method systems and operating system design. It affects presentation for particular situations. Rendering and type style selection turn out to be something very important that the IETF has rather carefully avoided, perhaps wisely. It includes confusable characters and deceptive strings, something there's been a great deal of discussion about as a security issue, among other things. There are language-specific convention issues where which become particularly important when you don't know what the language is. If things are specific to a language and you can't tell what the language is, you're in trouble. We have transition problems from ASCII-only systems and how we do that. A particular example which has caused a lot of stir is ASCII-only systems that are case insensitive, like the DNS, moving to an international environment where case insensitivity is not nearly as well defined as it is for ASCII, as people want to believe. And there are character encoding issues. Many of the selected solutions look like let's have this one and that one at the same time, and that causes horrible complications, more so in some systems than in others, unless there's broad consensus on what should be a canonical form and how to get to it, and that consensus is understood and accepted by end users. The simplest example for ASCII is while there have been many claims in the last several years that users always expect case insensitivity, we trained a whole generation of users with Unix and similar systems to not expect that at all. So these are often much more complicated issues than we tend to pretend. Next slide. So I'm going to focus today on the DNS and IDNA related issues, not because it's the most important, but because it's been causing the most fuss, and the urgent problems seem to lie there, even if other problems may in the long term be as or more important. I'm not going to spend time on it today, but there's a growing hypothesis that IDNA itself may have been a mistake. That's going to be possibly my most controversial statement for today. But backing out of IDNA may be impossible. And if that hypothesis is correct, then the question is how to make the best of a bad situation rather than how we make this perfect or wonderful or satisfy everybody. With IDNA at this point, there are many warts and drafts to address at least partially. Some of them fairly difficult and complicated. IETF actions in the last 3 years have been to do nothing. We've cleared up some précis definitional issues. We've got an IAB statement to ICANN, which suggests doing nothing until the IETF sorts this out. That statement is becoming, at least in some quarters, more problematic over time as more Unicode versions are released. We had a BOF called Lucid, which went down a few rat holes and at least in my opinion, led to nothing. And we've made some patches to allow some non-ASCII domains and email addresses and certs, some of which are now approved. But this kind of list is not our usual IETF definition of progress on core issues. Next slide. So the immediate problem is that we've got 3 drafts which are awaiting consideration or processing that are stuck. One of them and its predecessors has been stuck for 2.5 years. And that's the one that stimulated the IAB statement and started off with an issue with an Arabic character, but clearly expands considerably beyond that. We've got a draft which clarifies a DNS issue about taking responsibility. Nothing new there, but the clarity of the responsibility may be important. And we've got another draft about troublesome characters, which is one of several possible attempts to work around the issues rather than focusing on them head on, although again, this kind of thing may be the best we can do. We just don't know. We've got other work which hasn't produced drafts needed to address now known problems, but those 3 documents are the queue today and were really the queue 6 months ago. I want to ask a question now, which is how many people in the audience have not gone to sleep?
Everybody's looking around to see whose hands are up.
There was one hand that was halfway up.
Well, that's better than I expected. Okay, next slide. It's probably symptomatic of the large number of hands which went up. That people are not interested in getting dragged into this problem if they can possibly avoid it. That doesn't make the problem less important. But we've heard in a number of working groups, people stand up and say, what I really need is for you to just tell me what to do so I don't need to understand this. If the people who said that are in the room, you know who you are. That's so a recipe or search for a recipe so one can follow that recipe and be safe and have systems work and work globally without anyone having to think or understand very much in the process of design or implementation. And the bad news is it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because, as we keep discovering, every time we look in an area of this set of problems, we find idiosyncrasy. If it's good enough to display the characters, then there are things you can do. But if you want the characters displayed correctly or displayed the way, or displayed on receipt the way the sender intends, or displayed the way a normal reader of that language expects to see them, that's much harder, and it gets language specific and script specific. And what happens to us when we try to think about or discuss these issues is that we keep getting ourselves dragged into trivia. We fall into a Latin script trap. We understand how Latin script works, and therefore we understand how other scripts work. Well, that's false. Indeed, if we understand how ASCII works, extrapolating from there to understanding how Latin script works is also false. In other cases, we've got somebody who feels like if they understand two languages and how they work, or two writing systems and how they work, then they understand they can extrapolate to everything. And that's false as well. So in general, these extrapolations from one language or script don't work. Two languages or scripts don't work much better, but at the same time, the desire and expectation of the community is to just have this problem go away with some simple, easily followed formula. And the bad news, no such formula is out there. Next slide. So then the question is, what's to be done? If we actually care about internationalization for any of its purposes, continuing to do nothing is not an option. We found ourselves in a situation where there are many interpretations of IDNA out there. There are systems still using IDNA 2003. There are systems using IDNA 2003 with their private updates past Unicode 3.2, and everybody's got a different private update. We've got IDNA 2008. We've got some difficulties with IDNA 2008, and they've spawned their own interpretations. And we've got a Unicode spec, which is moving increasingly toward being a competing standard. This is, in some respects, no worse than a situation in which we have lots of competing standards out there. But every variation in every competing standard creates a risk of user confusion, a risk of systems not working as expected by the users or by the developers, including having false negatives or positives, but that's not limited to that. And every one of these sources of confusion is a potential vector for an attack. It's been claimed that there are fewer of these attacks than we might expect or than we have been claiming. But this is also related to attackers very often not needing to be smarter than they have to be, and that's a very temporary and unstable situation. Again, IDNA is not the only problem area here, but the DNS and its traditional matching rules and structures and assumptions imply special complications. Whatever we're doing now to solve these problems, it isn't working. Things are getting worse. Unless we can find another way, this is this area's problem to solve. If you think knowledge and depth about this area is bad here, go look at security. And go look in other areas about even the questions about whether one should internationalize or stick with ASCII as one looks at identifiers and protocol handshakes and so on. Next slide. As far as I know, we've discussed 3 groups of possibilities about how to move forward with this. The first and most obvious is to create a working group. But the problem there is having a critical mass of expert people. And that means a problem with leadership and a problem with resources as well as the people themselves. We're short on the people, we're short on the leadership, we're short on the resources. A second possibility, which has been kicked around, is to create some sort of special review team and really empower it. There's a problem with how to select membership. The question is whether the IASG or the community would accept the conclusions. But if this were going to work, we need to move between accept what that group says unless there's a counter argument or somebody raises a fuss, to accept what that group says unless there's a solid, grounded expert argument against it. Carries risks. Another suggestion which has been made is to leave the problem to someone else. The Unicode Consortium is the most frequent example, but I've heard some suggestions about various ICANN groups as well. This hasn't served us well in the past. It's one of the sources of contradictory advice that we're dealing with, contradictory, at least if one believes DNS names are identifiers. If one believes that they are simple expressions of thoughts or preferences or brands, then maybe there isn't a problem at all. And the Unicode folks seem to have problems conceiving of language-independent identifiers, at least when we've had those discussions about specific problems that they turn around and say, well, there's no problem because they're different languages, even if they're the same script. And obviously other ideas are welcome, but that's where we've gotten. Next slide. But as we look at this and move forward, remember that ignoring the issues and doing nothing creates risks. And the history, at least so far, is it either makes things get worse or lets them get worse. And if our job is to make the internet work better globally, then ignoring internationalization is inconsistent with that goal, and we need to figure out how to do something. Suggestions, comments? Thanks very much.
Okay, so John, I'm gonna shut you off for a minute while Pete's okay.
He can talk.
Well, I know, but I can't see other remotes.
Oh, okay.
That's the thing. Okay, well, go ahead, Pete. And then
Pete Resnick here at the mic. And if you would go back one slide, actually, it occurs to me leaving the problem to someone else alone is, of course, not going to work and hasn't traditionally. But it occurs to me that part of the problem we've run into with the Unicode Consortium in particular is that we are running independent, whether it be consensus or other sorts of decision processes, and they are not required to come to consensus themselves. That is, the Unicode Consortium has a set of desires about how stuff should be used. Sometimes we hear responses like, well, you should stop doing that. That's not how we designed this thing or intended it to be used. We've asked questions like, how should we use it properly? Can you guys do some sort of identifier system, since we're using some of these as identifiers? That turns out to be problematic. I'm wondering if one of the solutions is to figure out some way to actually do joint work with the Unicode Consortium such that the forcing function is both sets of parties, IETF folks and Unicode Consortium folks, have to come to consensus on the solution set. I don't know of any way for the IETF community to independently solve this problem, because there's not enough of us to spend enough time who have the appropriate expertise, and we don't have any lever to cause the Unicode Consortium to do anything differently than they're doing now.
Okay, why don't we let Leslie speak, and then we'll let John have the floor again.
Leslie Daigle, and I'm largely following on Pete's comments, I think, in that I think the problem that we've had with relying on it from the Unicode Consortium in the past has been the fact that they have different priorities and different purpose and don't fundamentally understand the things that are terribly important to us, like once you set something, don't change the tables. I mean, and the problem is that that's perfectly fine for their purposes. They're not wrong or evil. They're just differently motivated. So I think that I don't see a way to try to do joint work with them at that level. Although I agree with Pete that we don't currently have anything like the expertise to do this all ourselves. And I don't think we will ever have in the IETF realm the expertise to replicate all of the work that the Unicode Consortium has done, nor should we. So I think we need something that's maybe not a working group, but I think we need some honest to goodness IETF-based activity in order to make sure we get the attention of the rest of the IETF work to, listen to the advice that comes out and follow these guidelines for protocols going forward. If we don't have something that is grounded in the IETF, I don't think we're actually going to solve the problem. So that's just a lot of words characterizing what I see as the problem, and sadly no real answers about how do we move forward. But maybe the first piece of the puzzle is to identify how we can attract people who legitimately have expertise in this area and don't simply, know 2 languages or 2 scripts, to come play in our space a little bit and help sort out the rest of the problem.
Okay, thanks, Leslie. So I'll go ahead and hand it back over to John to see if he has any responses to those comments.
Yeah, the 2 observations. One of them is that there is really an important area of non-overlap between us and the Unicode Consortium. They are very, very good at coding characters, and we would be totally insane to go into that business, and we know it. We're pretty good at protocols and interchange among systems and certain things which have to work globally rather than within a certain known language context. Although we've had difficulty extrapolating that general knowledge into this area and making it work. But that's an important distinction. The other issue with Pete's suggestion is that I think there's an area where the Unicode Consortium folks who have been looking at this boundary and the IETF folks who've been looking at this boundary are in complete agreement. And that is the conclusion that the other group does not play well with other children, especially us. And it's an issue off of which I don't know how to move forward. But when we've got one group creating a standard in an area that we've got the IETF creating a standard in an area where we presumably know quite a lot, like the DNS, and then the Unicode Consortium comes along and creates a standard which effectively says, don't use that standard, use ours, then the basis for a collaborative environment is a little fragile.
Okay, so thanks, John. So we're going to go ahead and go back. We've got about 5, 6 people in the queue. Okay.
This is Barry Leba. Part of what I was going to say, Leslie said, the core of it being that the Unicode Consortium has a different need, different priorities. Their goal is to be able to reproduce documents. Our goal is to have characters from different scripts play well in names and labels. So, but beyond that, we have 2 separate issues. One is all the stuff that John has laid out with why the names and labels stuff is difficult and we need to do something to make that better. And perhaps the attempt that we made not perhaps, I think we have demonstrated that the attempt we made in Unicode 2008 to make it all rely on Unicode attributes and just make it all fall out of that isn't going to work, and we're going to have to do something that doesn't scale well. And we have very few people who really understand the issues well enough to work that out. But the other problem is that people developing protocols who are not in that group don't understand what they need to do in their protocol to make it work. We see very often just falling back to it's a UTF-8 string and thinking that's good enough without worrying about all of the issues that are involved with comparing and normalizing and all of that stuff. That part, we can do something about that. We can figure out some way to have guidance for protocol designers to tell them what they need to look at in order to get their strings to behave well in the environment we're asking them to work in. So I think we should put some effort into that.
Okay, thanks, Baron.
This is Yoshiro Yonea. I think this problem is very much have a good feedback from the user experiences. Not only the bad things, but also the good things. And to solve the problems, I think it is very important to work with the other standardization organizations such as WCC, which thinks about the appearances of the characters or usage of the applications. So I strongly agree to work with other SDOs.
Okay, Andrew.
Hi, my name's Andrew Sullivan. There are maybe two, maybe three things I want to say here. The first is I still don't hear in what we've discussed here at the microphone an answer that is sortable into these buckets that John has on this slide. We know that we have a problem in friction between a couple of different SDOs here. And it isn't obvious to me that, collaborating harder is going to work. But maybe that's another thing that goes in this other ideas, like we just try harder at that. The second thing, though, that I want to say is that people sometimes describe what Unicode's problem, what the UTC's problem is, typically in terms of documents or something like that. And that is not, in my understanding, what Unicode thinks they're doing. And I think that we need to sort of get over the idea that we have a clear idea of what other people who are doing are trying to do, because I think we're misdescribing it then. And that misunderstanding may be part of the gap that we're having in dealing with this other SDO. The final thing that I would say, though, is that our real problem here has to do with a thing that we normally regard as toxic, and that is this is really a user interface problem, right? These are identifiers that are leaked up into the user space, and if we didn't have any users who cared about those identifiers, then we wouldn't care about internationalizing them, because you could just use numbers or strings or whatever you wanted and it wouldn't matter. So part of the difficulty here is that we normally try to pretend that we don't have this kind of user interface problem, and this is user interface all over it. And I have no idea what to do about that, because we're not very good at it traditionally. And as John pointed out in his presentation, people keep saying, well, just give me the formula for that. But if you went to a user interface person and said, well, just give me the user interface formula, they would point and laugh at you. And that's really what our problem is here as well.
Okay, so we're going to do Ted and then Pete, and then we'll hand things back to John, and then we'll get back to the queue.
Ted Hardy, you could probably start pointing and laughing now without delay, because I'm going to describe two things, one of which is something which we tried in the past and failed, and the other of which is a slightly different description of this problem that I think means these buckets don't matter. One of the things we tried to do in the past in the world of URIs and URLs was to create an internationalized version called IRIs that we perceived to be a presentation layer format that always had a mechanism for moving back from the presentation layer format to what we conceived of as a wire format. And so the definition of IRIs was that these aren't the identifier, these are the presentation format, and the real identifier is the thing you get when you apply the transform to get the IRI back into a URI. And so URIs are our thing. We're the protocol people. We're always going to act on URIs. IRIs are totally going to be a presentation layer construct. This lasted less than 5 seconds, as XML namespaces immediately used IRIs rather than URIs as identifiers, and they leaked immediately, and everybody wanted to treat them as if they were their own construct and not URIs. So it was a great example of the attempt to separate out the concept of the user interface or the presentation layer format from the protocol piece, because it just didn't work at all. Maybe that was because we were doing it and we were mostly protocol people, but I think it's kind of unhelpful for us to say this is a user interface problem, and since we're not good at it, we're going to try and create an interface between the thing we're good at and that other thing, and let somebody else take care of the other thing, because our experience is things just leak out. The other point I kind of want to make here is that I've had some very good discussions with the Unicode Consortium folks. I think they understand to some degree the extent to which what we want and what they want have some conflicts, and one very critical part of it is they assume the presence of context we do not have. There are a lot of cases in which what they really care about is the ability of a local script community or a local language community to use a specific script to express a particular language. And so a single script may be used with multiple languages or even language families. And the result of that is, in order to figure out things like matching in real context, you often have to know not just what script is in use, but what language community is using that script for what language. And sometimes what era it is, if you've got historical documents to work with. And we look at our own systems, which are primarily around known item search or matching for things like passwords or usernames or DNS labels. And that's simply not context we have. In order to resolve this problem, their view of what we should do is change our systems to incorporate that context. Our problem is there are some considerations that we have, like the root of the DNS itself, where establishing what that context is would require both a lot of political will and people well outside of either of our rooms. If we're really going to tackle this, I think we can't assume that we're tackling it with the systems we have now. We have to really be willing to say, what are we going to change about how very fundamental things in our namespaces and applications work if we're really going to pull this in? So I think I don't wish to argue with John at all that this is important work, but I see no hope at all that a special review team could say this DNS thing is going to get replaced and have any legitimacy. And I would fear, in fact, that even a small working group would have the same problem.
Okay, so we'll put Pete, our JavaScript, at the microphone now.
Pete Resnick again. I just want to defend one thing I said from a point that Andrew made, which is not unreasonable, by the way. I'm not suggesting that what we do is try and join together harder, right? That we work harder at getting together or something. And I want to be perfectly frank here. The problem that we've seen consistently with trying to interact with the Unicode Consortium is we do it so far in a very formal way, using things that look like liaison statements and such, and there are personalities involved. And quite often, from either side, the response by those personalities is the other side is an idiot. And sometimes that's true in both directions. What I think I'm suggesting is that we need to have folks from the Unicode Consortium come into this circle and vice versa, that we actually do figure out ways within each set of procedures to insert folks into those procedures and actually say, no, the answer, you're doing it wrong, is not an acceptable outcome in either organization. And I can't remember the last time that I've seen certain senior leadership in Unicode Consortium here, and I don't even know what, well, there's that. And I don't even know what the mechanism for us to participate in Unicode Consortium is.
Okay. Alrighty. So, John, I don't see you in the queue, so I'm going to go ahead and go through the room queue. Leslie's up next.
Leslie Daigle. So I think we're not ready for that, Pete. I think we actually, to John's point and to some of the points that have been elaborated in the room today, we don't actually know what we want from Unicode. We don't actually know what we want to do. I think that what I'm hearing in part is that we should actually take the phrase Unicode Consortium off the table and sit back and have a rethink about, all right, now that we've gone through and tried these different approaches to things, which worked, very, very small list, which didn't and why, and what are our requirements going forward. And if that sounds exceedingly painful, I will observe that pain is conserved. We can either keep having this conversation over and over again and making no progress, or we can step back and do the architecture thing and try to think about what do we actually need to re-engineer and change in our approach to things so that we can accommodate these needful things. And then we can have the improve our dialogue with the Unicode Consortium or whoever else. And I take that back to John's earlier remark that we're pretty good at designing protocols and teasing apart requirements and whatnot. So maybe that's what we should actually do.
Okay, so John, if it's okay, Joe, they've just got one other person in the queue, so we'll let Joe speak and then hand it back to John.
Joe Hildebrand. So I got up to say roughly what Ted did at the end, which is one thing we haven't tried adequately is listening to the feedback that the Unicode Consortium has given us in terms of what their design was intended to do. We've taken the approach that backward compatibility overall allows us to sort of not explore some of the design space in terms of moving forward. One of the ways, the potential ways that is merely horrendously difficult, merely horrible in terms of the long-term consequences to the internet, merely horrible, would be to actually start thinking about how you would express different labels of an identifier marked up appropriately with locale, script, etc., and then using that as a part of the context. It would be awful, and getting the user interface right for that would be even harder. But it is at least an approach that is potentially might one day, 20 years from now, bear fruit. I am not suggesting that I want to work on that, but that this is one of the things that we haven't tried that is not really on the list.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Okay, John, I'm giving you floor back.
Yeah, I'm finding this discussion very interesting and a little bit helpful. But a few observations. The first is that this issue about differences in assumptions about context that Ted mentioned is a much better explanation of the comment I made earlier about identifiers with or without language context. But we've been there before, and we've discussed it, and we've discussed it with UTC, or at least its leadership. And we've had Unicode leadership and membership participating in some of these discussions in years past. Worth trying again, probably, but we should not pretend this has never been tried in either Ted's version or Pete's. I didn't anticipate this review team trying to replace DNS. My concern there is that while we are trying to figure out how to do something broader and architectural, if in fact we're up to doing that, we've got some immediate problems which may need solving or patching. And taking those immediate problems and saying, after we have boiled an ocean or two, we will get back to them, is probably not a practical solution, even if it's a tempting one. And the special review team notion really had to do with that patching process rather than with architecture. Joe, I understand your comment, I think, about backward compatibility. But remember that the biggest single issue we've had with backward compatibility was that certain people associated with the Unicode Consortium decided that IDNA 2008 was worth sabotaging because its explicit decision was made that some small number of characters couldn't be backward compatible. And their rules about stability have often been part of the problem here because those rules prevent discussions about how things might be tweaked to work better, because once a decision is made in a broad number of areas, that decision can't be changed. I'm very sympathetic to that point of view from other parts of my life, but there are backward compatibility problems here, and they lie at least as much on that side as on the other side. I think, again, taking a different tack on Ted's statement, I think we've got symmetrical problems here in terms of our vocabularies and assumptions. I certainly agree that describing them as being entirely about printing is misleading, might have been correct a very long time ago, is not correct now. But there's a large difference between there and these contextual issues. To give a specific example from a variation on Joe's remarks, we could encode all that stuff with identifiers, but then the question would be how to use it and how users would encode it when they see something in passing. And we've discussed that for years and years and years and reached no conclusions, and involved Unicode people, and they haven't been helpful. Have involved W3C people, and they have sometimes been helpful. But the problem spaces are a little different, and that's the most positive view of this mess, which one can take, says the problem spaces are different and have to be seen differently, and then some adjustments need to be made at the boundaries.
Okay. So this is Joe Hildebrand. I stood up to make sure that we're not necessarily constraining the technical design space with our memories of historical personnel or personality issues that we might have ascribed to certain people in certain places. One of the things that I think that we can at least do on our side is try and be as good a potential partner in this space as possible. And one of the things that would work toward that is us being able to at least listen to some of the technical input that we've seen from a variety of places.
Mm-hmm. And Joe, I do not disagree with you, but we've been doing a lot of listening actually, and there's been a lot of input from that direction incorporated into some of our existing work.
Okay,
Go.
Pete's up next.
Pete will have to be last, and then we need to figure out where we take the discussion next. Pete.
I'm Pete Resnick. In response to a little of what John said and a little of what Leslie said, one of my concerns is that if we start going down the path independently of what is the problem space, and I agree with Leslie, we haven't gone through that exercise and need to. But if we start doing that without Unicode Consortium people involvement up front, we're going to end up making certain assumptions as we develop that design of the problem statement where, and I can hear certain people's voices in my head right now saying, you're doing it wrong. And it's going to be on some underpinning issue that we assumed we need to solve. And I think part of the issue is we need to convince Unicode folks that those issues are real issues and we need to address them and figure out at least a common language to describe what problems we're trying to solve. So I don't know how we do this completely independently for any period of time and get to a solution.
Agreed.
So it sounds like we have we're running very short on time here, but I don't hear a close to this discussion. So would we like to take this to the art list or one of the IDNA lists, or what would be appropriate next step here for the interested community? Or John, of course, you're still on, so if you have a suggestion.
Yeah, I mean, there's existing mailing lists where we could
Right.
toss it, but
Yeah.
Well, the existing mailing lists are very good for discussing, or not so good, for some of the reasons that are given for discussing the technical and protocol issues. But the immediate issue is that we've got these drafts floating around. We've got people dependent on those drafts being resolved in some fashion or another, and we haven't figured out a way to process them.
So Barry's at the mic and there's a powwow of ADs, so please go ahead.
Yes, I'm standing in a circle of 3 ADs who are all just sort of whispering to each other.
They're really just saying harumph, 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 nothing else.
This is Barry.
gotta be quick.
There's the issue of getting these 3 drafts dealt with, and sure, we can talk about that on the art list, and I don't think there are any other lists that are better suited for that. But there's the broader issue of what to do about the problems in the long term, and talking about that on the art list is not going to help us particularly, I don't think. The concern that I have about forming a working group on it is that we then get a lot of people who really don't understand the issues who come and say, it's simple, you just have to do this. And we've seen that happen many times in the past. So there was one in particular who just said, just spell Zurich, Z-E-U-Z-U-E-R-I-C-H, and you're done. Zed, I hear over here from the Canadian. Anyway, so there's a lot of distractions involved in that. On the other hand, setting up a review team of the people who understand the issues and can go powwow on this makes it look like we're closed and we're not, we want to hide something. So I'm really stuck on that. The short term, we just need to get these 3 drafts sorted out on the art list, and let's do that. For the longer term, I don't have any better ideas than anybody else has come up with.
Okay.
Adam.
So yeah, I think what Barry said about the treatment of these 3 documents is probably quite reasonable. A good way to move forward. On the larger issue, what I'm going to propose is that there's been a lot of input here, and it's not all necessarily pointing in the same direction. So I think that Ben, Alexi, and I would like some time to sort of put our heads together on this topic, and then come back to the art list with a proposal of how to move forward.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah.
Ben's proposing that crying for help might be an option as well.
The art list is very sympathetic to cries for help, I'm sure.
If you as ADs cry for help, I will try to answer.
If I can just throw out one idea that we somehow haven't managed to touch on. Nobody suggested an IAB workshop.
Well,
it is architecture.
Yeah, I was going to do that. But.
Okay, can we go with the suggestion of starting the conversation on art and let it lead where it makes sense to lead it?
Well, the ADs
and the ADs, yeah, okay.
Yeah, Martin Thompson, maybe not for the IAB, but I'll point out that we hold this particular issue near and dear to our hearts and are actively looking at ways in which we can slice off a piece of it that could constructively be turned into something like a work item or a workshop or a program or something like that.
Andrews.
The problem we have is the same problem that everyone else has.
Okay.
Right.
Barry.
Right, and this is Barry. There just was an IAB workshop on naming, and we discussed all of this stuff in circles. The IAB also just closed the internationalization program because it was going around in circles and not really accomplishing anything. So. Martin says, not because we don't want to work on it, which I agree with. There are a lot of people who want to work on it, but we just don't know how.
Right. Okay. We're out of time. And we are approaching out of time. This other working group starts in 2 minutes in this same room. So thank you for coming. Watch for this topic on the art list, and we'll see you all in London. Oh, John just packed me in. Oh, he just ran away.
Yeah, we lost him. Oh no, he's
here.
Back. So, I don't know if
right.
he's back or not.
Okay.
Okay. John, you've got the floor, although we're out of time.
I think we've run out of time, and I'm anxious to pursue the suggestion from the ADs and see if that leads anywhere.
Okay,
I could say some more inflammatory things, but it would just waste time.
No, it goes straight into me.
Okay, thanks, John.
Okay, so this room is now HTTP. If you are leaving the room, please do so now without the kind discussions, because we have a very tight schedule. So please, let's make this transition as quick as we possibly can. That includes